to the Nutrimedical Report, and Harley, we've got some pretty important news items to cover today, so let's start from the top.
Yeah, I think we can get to the presidential campaign toward the end of the discussion, but I think people really have to look at the starting point for any policy discussion, and that is that we're living in a bankrupt system that's on life support, as you like to put it, using your medical terminology.
Yeah, it's in the ICU. It's one of the junior residents thinks the patient's going to make it overnight, and rigor mortis is already setting in.
And they've run out of blood for transfusions.
Right, plus the patient's hypoxic because the mask isn't properly put on, or the intubation tube is kind of fallen out. Actually,
they have plenty of blood, but it's the wrong type.
Well, the blood is exactly from the wrong species. How's that?
Well, here's the latest. The governor of the Reserve Bank of India, which is India's central bank, is a guy named Raghuram Rajan, and he's very highly thought of internationally because he's one of the people who speaks the truth. And he was one of the people pushing India toward the BRICS because he said, we don't need helicopter money, we need investment in developing the economy. Now, he came out 2 days ago with a statement saying, our world, this is a quote now, our world is facing an increasingly dangerous situation. Both advanced and emerging economies need to grow in order to ease domestic political tensions. And yet, few are. If governments respond by enacting policies that divert growth from other countries, that beggar my neighbor tactic will simply foster instability elsewhere. What we need are new rules of the game. And then here's what he said on that. He said that we need a new international agreement along the lines of Bretton Woods. He said setting the rules will take time, but the international community has a choice. We can pretend all is well with the global monetary non-system and hope that nothing goes spectacularly wrong. Or we can start building a system fit for the world of the 21st century.
Right.
Now, that's pretty significant. He's a guy who in 2005 criticized Ben Bernanke at the Jackson Hole Conference, saying that there are risks in the financial system that are being made worse by the Federal Reserve policy. And Larry Summers said that he is misguided and that he's a Luddite, in other words, working with old technologies. So here's a guy who actually was right in 2005 about the crash that occurred in 2007. He's warning again today that this must be done. This is, of course, what LaRouche has been saying for years, that if you don't get out of this system, one of these days the whole thing is going to come down on your head and it'll be too late. So this is to take this as another warning, but that this is completely off the pages of any discussion in the election campaign or in the U.S. media.
Right. Well, the thing is that the election will be a minor factor, considering these other ones will swamp it.
Well, this is what people don't realize, that you're voting for a new captain on the Titanic. And what we need is to find someone who has a plan to get off the Titanic and move on to a more stable situation.
Right.
And the problem is the political system won't allow that. Instead, they prefer the kind of sniping and criticism and gutter politics that we've seen. And meanwhile, we're being besieged again by terrorists. And I think in one of the things that I sent you has a very compelling quote from Peskov, who's the Russian Speaker of the Duma, about what happened in Brussels yesterday. He said the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, who is in Brussels, he said the head of NATO is warning about imaginary Russian soldiers in Ukraine while terrorists are blowing up the infrastructure right under his nose.
Right.
And I think that's a very useful quote that people should think about what that means.
This is not by contrived incompetence. It's by purposeful intention that they're allowing this massive flood, that they're not controlling the terrorism. I'm sure their intelligence agencies has more information than they're admitting, whether before the Paris attacks or Brussels, which happened yesterday. It's my feeling that they want terrorism because they want to balkanize the population. They want to dilute the culture, and they want to create a trade zone. They really are determined to force people to kind of really swing to the right so they can form a fortress Europe after they've created a destitution system in Europe. The same thing in America. We have Obama with an open policy in borders. And again, instead of improving trade with countries, which is smart trade like Trump talks about, you hear both Obama and now Hillary Clinton saying she's going to make sure she pushes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, etc. These are terrible agreements.
Well, then you have, I was wrong, by the way, Peskov, who I quoted, is actually the spokesman for the Kremlin, spokesman for Putin. Putin sent very strong condemnation, assured the Belgian people that Russia would work with them against terrorism. And Putin said, it's more urgent than ever that we collaborate to defeat the terrorists. Now, Maria Zakharova, who's the foreign ministry spokesman, made a really important point. She's the Russian foreign ministry spokesman. She said, as more and more time and lives are lost, people are beginning to understand that this policy of double standards in evaluating terrorist activities is a dead-end policy. Now, listen to this. She said, they can't support terrorists in one part of the globe and not expect them to appear in other parts.
Well, in fact,
now, what she's referring to is that the West has been, through the efforts to continue to attack Russia's policy in Syria, they're aiding and abetting the very terrorists who struck in Brussels.
Exactly. In other words, they actually supply materials. We know they're going to go in the hands of al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, ISIS, and ISIL. They know that these same people, by the way, there's three reasons for the massive surge into Europe. And the first reason over the last 20 years is increasing drought. The second reason is war that we've created and breaking up these nations and making them unlivable, like Libya, Syria, Iraq. And the third reason is the third jihad. The Muslims see this as a sign from Allah that it's time to actually, with Hiraj, do ummah, and do a jihad to take over these nations. And it's not all of them, it's 5%, but the problem is the other 95% are too passive to stop the 5% from blowing up places like the airport and the bus areas and so on in Brussels, or major terrorism, which is coming this year, because both you'll get a bipartisan domestic security bill that both Democrats and Republicans will support, which will take away more of our rights. And, of course, the gun-grabbing maniac, of course, Hillary, and whoever she appoints, because what I see happening with the Republican National Committee still not getting on side behind Trump. I see Trump getting the nomination, but I'm very fearful he won't become president. And if Hillary gets in, the policies of Obama will be a third term of disaster. And they won't stop terrorism. They will actually support it, foment it while they're criticizing it. It's so obscene to see Obama criticize terrorism when he actually supplies them with armaments and refuses to do things like stopping G20 nations from buying their oil and bombing the oil wellheads when he says it's an environmental disaster. It's like, excuse me? That's why the Russians can come in with a very small amount of armaments and over a period of only 5 months destroy ISIS and ISIL so that they're pulling out now. Because they've done their job, but they can pull back in pretty quick if the agreement's
and they changed the rules. They essentially said, we're not going to allow this business as usual to continue. And we don't care what you say. We made you offers repeatedly to join us. And Obama turned them down. Instead, today, Obama is in Argentina, where there's been a Wall Street coup against the government there. And I'll report that after the break.
Yeah. Well, what I see happening is the global puppeteers are fomenting disaster and then trying to claim that they're going to solve the problem. They've been the creator of the dialectic of, creating the monster, then trying to pretend they're going to destroy the monster. They're the ones that actually are the monsters. And welcome back. Harley, let's continue on this important dialogue, because I think a lot of these issues, and probably this year, are going to overtake whoever happens in the election. In other words, I'm hoping it's Trump. I really think that he'll be able to actually if he gets back on track and stays presidential and sticks to the issues that he's talked about rather than, deviating, and then getting better advisors so that he knows, for example, if you want to stop the drug trade coming into Vermont, it's not just this wall, which is going to stop 100 million people in the next 20 years who'll just try to get here because the rest of the world economy is crashing and the drought that's occurring in countries like the Middle East. It's a matter of, hey, you got to stop the CIA and the Department of Injustice and the FBI from bringing the $2 trillion worth of drugs into the country and destroying the underclass in these big cities like the blacks and Hispanics and the poor whites. What's really going on is you've got to get to the guts of what's really going on, why the country's being degraded by corrupt politicians and corrupt corporations. And the fact that Hillary Clinton supports the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic partnerships just shows how evil she is. It's just amazing.
Well, I think what you're getting at from our discussion over the break, my concern, Mr. LaRouche's concern, is that this is not at this point about personalities or even specific issues, but about can we get a portion of the American population thinking? Because if we have even a small minority of Americans thinking strategically, we'll be able to rally the population to do what has to be done. We can see that people are in a state of revolt against the political institutions. But revolt only shows that they're beginning to wake up that what they've been told is real and true is not real and not true. It doesn't mean they have solutions. And what we're trying to do is give people a picture, a roadmap of how the enemy of this country has been operating for the last 40 years through people like the Bush-Cheney administration, through Obama, through Hillary Clinton, and through Ted Cruz, who's a Bush guy. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care how much he praises Jesus and talks the talk. He's a Bush man. Now, here's the issue where you can separate those people who are serious about defending the American system from the empire. Why is Obama in Argentina today? All the conservatives have their feathers ruffled about him going to Cuba, which is relatively insignificant. Right. Argentina, a coup just took place. There was a government there under Kirchner and then his wife, Cristina Kirchner, that was fighting against the globalists. The globalists had loaded up Argentina with a huge debt. Argentina was an economy, it was the 8th largest economy in the world in the 1970s. It has industry, it has science, it's got all kinds of potential. But under Wall Street and University of Chicago fascist economists, they got loaded up with debt. And then that debt, the sovereign debt, was sold off by the people holding it to hedge fund operators, actually vulture fund operators, for a nickel on the dollar. Those vulture fund operators went to court in New York City and got a judge's ruling that not only did Argentina have to pay back 100% of the face value, but another 50% fine on top of that for late fees and for not making the payment. Cristina Kirchner, who was the president at the time, refused. She said a New York court has no jurisdiction over the government of Argentina. And so that judge in New York City ordered or said that the hedge fund operators could seize Argentine ships at sea, Argentine national property, and so on.
Wow.
So in the follow-up election that took place about 2 months ago, Wall Street and the City of London flooded Argentina with liquidity to generate an inflation, and then ran a candidate who said he has a solution for the inflation, a guy named Macri. He got elected. What's his policy? Austerity, wage cuts, cuts in government services, cuts in spending, all to make sure that Argentina can pay the debt. And this is the guy that Obama is going to go down to honor in Argentina. When he should be working with Putin to crush terrorism, he's in Argentina praising a City of London looting operation against that country, and probably to meet with people in Brazil who are trying to do the same thing to the Brazilian government, which is fighting against the same globalist bankers.
Yeah.
So that's where the strategic situation stands right now. Who's out there denouncing Obama? They denounce him on the cheap shots that he's not saying much about Belgium. Well, what's he going to say? He supports the damn terrorists. Is he going to admit that? No, of course not. So instead of saying he should be in Washington, he should be impeached for his commitment to defending and aiding and abetting enemies of the United States. That's called treason. And that's what he's done in his support for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And instead of that, they play these little silly games like Obama shouldn't be at a ball game in Havana, he should be back in the White House. If he were back in the White House, he'd be trying to figure out how to do more to help the terrorists. We don't want him in the White House. We want him in jail.
Yeah. Wow.
So
amazing.
That's the kind of thing the American people have to talk about, as opposed to these manufactured issues, that capture people's attention.
But it also demonstrates, to be honest with you, the only candidate that actually even has a chance, even though he's not a perfect candidate by any means, is Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders is a clown who doesn't have a way of doing what he wants to do. Hillary Clinton is so corrupt it's obscene. I think even Obama is afraid of her, and she's afraid of him. It's a very strange thing when Bill Clinton makes direct criticisms of the last 8 disaster years. You can actually go to the internet and actually watch the video clip of Bill Clinton criticizing Obama. Even AIPAC is trying to apologize to Obama for criticism made by Trump against Obama in terms of the way that he's handled. This is in the Jerusalem Post. AIPAC apologized for Donald Trump's attack on President Obama. Why? He's been the worst enemy of Israel's ever had.
Here's the other thing. When you're talking about Hillary and Obama, about who's afraid of whom, the establishment that controls both of them, the higher level of elites, the real satanic forces in the world tied to the City of London and Wall Street, they run both of them. They're capable of bumping either of them off or both of them off to suit their purposes. At this point, as they're facing the danger of losing everything, what do? They unleash terrorism across Europe. They try to sabotage an agreement that the Russians imposed on the United States to stop the fighting in Syria. In order to do that, the Russians had to go in and run a relatively effective series of attacks against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Putin has said repeatedly, join with us. We're willing to join you, you join us. We don't care who joins who. Let's fight these terrorists. And Obama says not until Assad is gone.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And, of course, if Assad goes, it means the terrorists will set up a caliphate. Jerusalem and Israel will fall. Jordan will fall, and we'll have a real catastrophe on our hands. All manufactured by the same globalists.
And then Obama tells the Atlantic that he's tough on Assad.
Continue. What I see is disaster on the horizon. I see purposely they create these conditions in Europe so they would have a collapse of civilization and a class of civilizations. I see a fortress Europe rising out of the ashes of this mess they've created. And, of course, that means that this fortress Europe will be under the total thumb of the European banking system, and it'll be very dangerous because you now have a superstate that's, I think altogether all of the European countries add up to over 500 million people. We're not talking about third world people like China, where only basically 200 million are industrialized, and the rest of the 1.2 billion in China are in agrarian areas that are like centuries into the past. Even if you go 5 streets off the main drag in China, even in major cities, you think you're back 2 centuries. So we're dealing with a very advanced civilization with very advanced technology, and if it turns into a police state like the rise of the Reich in Germany with advanced technology, you're dealing with a pretty formidable situation. And people don't really understand this. Americans, the Russians do, the Chinese do. They understand that what's going on with extreme Islam isn't being dealt with because it's part of the dialectic to create a catastrophe, which the banks want. They want this catastrophe. They're begging for it, aren't they?
Well, LaRouche did a video back in, I think, 1999 called Storm Over Asia, in which he took the writings of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's one of the mentors of the current democratic regime, through his protege Madeleine Albright, whose protege is Susan Rice, who's one of the troika of witches who control Obama. Susan Rice, Samantha Power, and Valerie Jarrett. Now, what LaRouche went through in that storm over Asia is that the British policy from the beginning of the 20th century, which led to the drawing up of the maps that created the Arab states in ways that were non-organic, pitting tribes against each other, tribes that had hatred for each other in the same state, sects and families that couldn't get along, just put them all under an artificial system of statehood. And we've seen that there were attempts to stabilize that by some leaders in these countries, what Saddam tried to do, what Assad was doing, what Gaddafi was doing. But that goes against the narrative of Brzezinski that LaRouche was identifying, which is clash of civilizations. Now, the way to understand this is that most people think we're dealing with a problem of religious war. But even when we had Christian against Christian, the Catholic versus Protestant wars of religion in the 16th and 17th and 18th century in Europe, those were really about broader imperial geopolitical interests that used religion as a way of whipping up the masses to go out and die for a cause that they thought would get them to heaven, when in fact it was just increasing the power of the local duke or lord.
Right.
Now, that's what's going on in the Middle East today. And here we have, you see how unsophisticated Americans are when they try to identify the problem as an internal Islamic problem. The Islamic world has been dominated from the top by British finance and British intelligence operations going back to the 1880s. That still exists today. And people like Brzezinski were trained by those very British operatives like Bernard Lewis, who are the ones who are trying to promote the idea of clash of civilizations. Now, why do they want a clash of civilizations? This is the same thing as the project for a new American century of the neocons. If Brzezinski is sort of a British liberal, the neocons are right-wing so-called conservatives, but they all go to the same master, which is the City of London. And their idea of a clash of civilizations is to do what? It's to prevent the emergence of a new global financial system based not on funny money and central banks, but on physical economy, physical production, and a real commitment to unleashing the creative power of the whole of humanity, as opposed to feathering the nest of the upper 1%.
Right.
And so once you understand that, then you can begin to see how things work. Why do Shias suddenly want to kill Sunnis when they've lived together for 200 years in peace? Well, when you start pouring in money and arms and start provoking people and bringing in a third force. Another good example of this, Bill, is Ukraine. You know, there's been a long-standing movement that goes back to the 9th century of the Ukrainians and the Russians being brothers in the Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church may be different than the Russian Orthodox, but Kievan Rus was the name of the early Russian civilization, which was Christianized out of Kiev. Now, there are people in Ukraine who see the Russians today as their brothers. They may speak different languages, but they could work together. Right. This was broken up by the intervention of the European Union and NATO. For what purpose? Well, Russia was trying to help Ukraine with a financial crisis that we forced with making a coup in Ukraine. Ukraine broke from Russia. They then signed memos of understanding with the IMF and the World Bank and the EU. What's the result? Ukraine is more poor today by far than it was 3 or 4 years ago, and much more poor than had the Russians been allowed to continue their loan and their investment in Ukraine to build up the country. So people have to understand that they're being played for fools by these geopolitical imperial forces who don't care about America or Ukraine or Russia or Mohammed. They care for none of that. They use these things to provoke wars and chaos so they can continue their looting.
Right. Yeah. In fact, you mentioned something on the break that it might have a kind of a temporal link between this meeting that was going to go on in Europe dealing with the banking situation and Glass-Steagall and this string of terrorism that occurred. There might be a link.
Well,
can you want to describe that?
Yeah, sure.
At least
I mean,
temporal
the
link.
thing you have to realize is that you can't really know for sure what the timing is of terrorists or what specific thing sets them off, because in many cases the people, if someone's a suicide bomber, they're inherently unstable and really don't give a damn about humanity. They can be channeled in certain directions by intelligence agencies, protected and so on, but you don't know for sure about the timing. But here's something which, as you said, sounds like something more than a coincidence. There are hearings going on in Brussels right now on the failure of the European Union's single resolution mechanism to unify its banking. In a sense, what this means is the European Union really is a banker's dictatorship, and they're trying to introduce new laws that will protect the banks from a backlash when the economy gets worse and worse and worse in Europe. So there's a group which is one of these, it's a non-governmental organization, but it includes people from all 28 European nations in the EU, that passed a proposal that called for junking the EU single resolution mechanism, which favors the too-big-to-fail banks and would loot the savings in regional banks. Instead, go with Glass-Steagall and a credit policy so that the smaller banks can fund the real economy, the small and medium enterprises. They were supposed to meet at 1 p.m. in an office in a meeting of the European Parliament yesterday. And that meeting was called off because of the bomb attack that took place half a block from the European Parliament building.
Yeah. That's amazing. The timing and the temporal timing and the positional timing is, the place is amazing. In other words, I think that, to be honest with you, it's almost like a lot of the Yemeni terrorists and so on that have been, in a sense, at a distance managed by CIA, etc. Although these people are under controlled and so on, they're often supplied, they're given information as to when to move at higher ups and connect to, let's say, the CIA. So it would not be at all surprising to me that the timing happened to be at the same time they're going to have this meeting. Wouldn't at all. And Harley, let's continue. I think now that we're in the list class segment, let's touch on some of the things that are happening here locally. My personal feeling is that the AIPAC speech was powerful by Trump, but I'm amazed that AIPAC actually apologized to Obama for what basically is very bad behavior in terms of Israel. I mean, the deal they made with Iran is insane. The fact that the CIA and various elements within Mossad, probably not all of them, are collaborating with ISIS and ISIL, which puts, an actual threat to the state of Israel. And I see these, the very fact that they want to set up a caliphate in Jerusalem means at some point the duplicity of Obama and possibly Clinton, if she gets in, will mean the fall of the state of Israel. I see a situation which is very dangerous for the whole world, with policies that are literally allowing the Ummah, the invasion Hiraj on Europe and now America, and Western nations like Australia, and the pushback by the population is going to get very, very violent. I think these politicians are running scared. We have, for example, Angela Merkel, who's lost 3 cantons in Germany just last week. It's very probable that she's going to be removed from power, and there's going to be a move in Europe toward, in a sense, police states. So you won't have free movement around Europe, and you'll eventually have, with their financial system going on, you'll eventually have Fortress Europe. This is going to get very nasty, and for the Muslims who think they're just going to kind of invade and take over, they're playing with the tiger, and they're going to get eaten. It's going to get very nasty, and it's all part of the dialectics because they're being used as a weapon to create the chaos that allow the global billionaires to steal even more of the value out of the economy while they collapse it and then start reducing the world population with war, pestilence, and God knows what else.
Well, as we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes or so, the world that most people see from television in the media is very different from the real world, because there are movements underway to take the power away from this financial elite, which has been involved in destroying the United States.
Right.
Now, what I can do, which I've done repeatedly with your listeners, is offer them access to that real world that exists outside of the bubble of U.S. politics. And you can get to that. The entry point is through LaRouchePAC.com. And I think I reported this last week. We have a new free service for people, which is called the Daily Lead, which every day one of our editors compiles an overview of the leading stories and what that means for our mobilization to change the country. And that's available. You can go to LaRouchePAC.com and go to the top of the homepage, and you'll see something that says Get Active. And click on that and go down to where it says Daily Lead, and it's very simple. You just sign up for it, and you get it in your email every morning.
That's really
now,
good.
The reason I'm emphasizing this is that we're dealing with really high-level strategy. The Putin moves in Syria changed the world. The Chinese moves for the Silk Road have changed the world. You see governments like Egypt, which is taking a leading role in fighting against terrorism in North Africa, including in Libya. The Egyptians are very much oriented toward working with the Chinese, and they're working toward building rail connections to South Africa so that North Africa and South Africa will actually be connected, so you can have an internal development process which is not controlled by imperial banks. Now, something similar was underway in South America, and the Brits are using every aspect of operations they can put in place to counter this. That's what's happening in Argentina, which we were talking about earlier, and in Brazil. Now, in the United States, we're seeing a campaign which is largely devoid of specific policy measures that are essential if our nation is going to survive. We have to break the power of the City of London, which is represented primarily by the Obama administration and by Hillary and by Ted Cruz. You know, Ted Cruz just appointed Phil Gramm as his chief economic advisor. Gramm is the author of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which is the bill which did away with Glass-Steagall, which allowed for the bubble that occurred that popped in 2008. Why would you bring in one of the most imbecilic figures, who, by the way, is since he left the Congress, Phil Gramm, remember his wife was on the board of Enron. She's supposedly a leading economist, and Graham's been on the board of the Union Bank of Switzerland, which has been named repeatedly for scams in the LIBOR scandal, in drug money and gun running, money laundering, and so on. So you have an establishment which doesn't want to give up. And if they feel threatened, they'll use terror. They'll use assassination. They'll use slander. We see, again, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, but I can see very clearly an establishment with the knives out to make sure his message is not heard. Some of what he's saying is useful, just as some of what Bernie Sanders says is useful. But as you point out, Bernie's clinging to Obama has disqualified him as a serious candidate. So to summarize this, and I don't want to just keep talking, go to LaRouchePAC.com, go to the Get Active icon at the top of the page, and get a daily briefing lead, and start using it. And I don't mean use it to go out and necessarily support LaRouche, although I think you should, but get your friends talking about the real world that exists outside of the bubble in which we in the United States live at present.
Yeah, I think it's important you understand this, and of course, as you mentioned, some of the advisors that even Trump is talking about are concerning, at the very least. Well,
and I think the more important point overall is that we have an opportunity. And you know what they say, opportunity comes knocking, and you better open the door, because it may not come back again. This opportunity is the potential to break the power of the City of London and Wall Street. that operate through the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the U.S. Federal Reserve to make us slaves to money. And in a sense, the biggest problem in America is that too many Americans who know better, who know that these elites are satanic figures, nevertheless are seduced by their desire to make money. So they end up trapped in a system which is destroying them and literally eating their children. And so, I can't state strongly enough. Mr. LaRouche has been really pounding at this point that it's our own corruption, our own willingness to tolerate this system with the idea that maybe we'll get a few crumbs, which has disarmed the American people and made them subject to a form of slavery, which is an extremely clever way of keeping us from asserting our true national legacy. And we've got to break it, and the way you break it is you start taking on your own bad habits.
Right. Yeah, and the first thing, of course, is to get out of the emotional as well as the intellectual matrix and, take the red pill.
Well, and, this is why I run into so much opposition when I tell people we still have to impeach Obama. We have to get him out. One of the red dyes, speaking of red pills, is conservatives that say they hate everything Obama does, but they say, well, you can't impeach him. Why not? If he's as bad as you think he is, and I think he's probably worse than most people think he is, why not try to get rid of him?
Well, I think
legally?
in the next number of months, there's several things that I think are options that could happen. The first is, you said the disaster in Brussels. If something happened that was, say, 10 times worse in America, a bipartisan domestic security bill would basically preempt elections and make Obama pres for life as long as he's in a state of martial law.
Well, I'm not worried about that. I think we need a real uprising.
Oh, of course we do. The uprising has to happen with people waking up that Brussels and in Northern California with the disaster with terrorism, the open borders, the financial things, the supporting of ISIS and ISIL by Obama on the one hand, but he's criticizing them on the other hand. All of this is maintaining the dialectic of the lies that he's doing. I call him the liar in chief. Actually, his name is the Lying King. How's that?
Why not?
Yeah, we should have a new, sequel to the Lion King with Obama's face made on the lion. The lion.